Hello, I'm Robert, and this time we're going to talk about whether human beings and extraterrestrials could communicate with each other using music. This was a question I was asked on the space show a few weeks ago. And it's inspired by the 1970s movie, and this theme tune. So that's Close Encounters of a Third Kind, and that's the music that the extraterrestrials use to communicate with the humans in this movie. So is this just a rather fun movie idea, or does it actually correspond to something? Is there something a bit more to it than that? And might we be able to communicate with extraterrestrials perhaps more readily in music than in other ways? And so first of all, obviously it's going to depend on the extraterrestrials. So the many human beings indeed who don't appreciate music, they either just don't like it or can't hear it too clearly, or maybe profoundly deaf and so on. And more interestingly, then the extraterrestrials, then the way they experience sound might be very different from the way that we experience sound. So, simple example, they might experience sound the way bats do, as a form of echolocation. And in that case, their music might be extremely difficult for us to understand unless it is translated, perhaps into something we can understand, for instance, some kind of landscape or 3D shapes or whatever. And our music might equally be very difficult for them to understand unless it's translated. And what they might experience, interesting to think about, for instance, what would it be like if the extraterrestrials experience light the way that we experience sound, and we experience sound the way we experience light. And this brings out somewhat how unusual the way it is that we experience sound. So we do have some spatial experience of sound, so you might surprise yourself, blind yourself and get someone to clap and try and point in the direction of the clap. You might be surprised at how accurately you can pinpoint exactly where the clap came from. So we do have a rather fine resolution of spatial resolution in sound, but we don't make much use of it. And that is horizontally, and we also have a certain amount of resolution vertically. That's like it's apparently partly due to the reflection of the sound off our shoulders and the shapes of our ears. And also there are other cues such as reverberation and the way sound bounces off objects in our environment. And this gives us a sense also of depth as well. And of course the sound's getting quieter as they get further away as well. So we do have quite a spatial experience of sound, and we do actually respond to this, but not very much aware of it in our daily life. And it is not really made much use of in our music, and or at least it's quite rare for it to be used in our music in any significant way. So you have more depth of appreciation of the music if it feels more immersive, if you've got this three-dimensional component to it. But you can still appreciate the music very much so, even if you listen to it in mono. And listening to mono is not even one-dimensional, that's zero-dimensional, it's like a single point that you're listening to. And the equivalent in visual would be like reducing an entire painting or entire movie to a single torch, shining out a single colour, and maybe it slightly changes in colour from time to time. And you really would lose most of the essence of the movie if you did that. But when you do that with sound, then you really lose very little when you reduce the sound to mono in that way. And this is because we experience sound in a very different way from the way we perceive light. So in our ears, we have numerous tiny hairs that respond to different frequencies, and we can hear lots of different frequencies simultaneously and pick them all out and pick out the intensity of every single frequency. and we can hear relationships between these frequencies of octaves and fifths and things like that. Whereas in light, we have numerous receptors in the back of our eyes, but they're all tuned to the same colour or just a few different colours, and plus black and white. So we have black and white and 3 colours, and most human beings, some have less, and some rarely may have 4 colour receptors. And on the computer screen, then we have very high visual resolution, but the individual pixels use just 3 colours to build everything. So you have red, green and blue, because the way light mixes is a bit different from the way paints mix. And so just using red, green and blue, you get all the colours on the computer screen, just different intensities of those. And there's no way of telling the difference visually between a yellow, unless it's a very intense yellow, then a normal kind of a yellow, as you see on the computer screen, then is completely indistinguishable from a mixture of red and green light. We simply can't tell whether we are watching and looking at a mixture of red and green light, or we're looking at yellow. And so if extraterrestrials perceived sound like that, they wouldn't be able to tell a difference between a chord consisting of a mixture of C and G, or the single note E. Both would sound exactly the same to them. Say, to give an example, something like that. And we have no, in light, we have no experience at all of octaves, and we have no of fifths or frequency relations between different colours. So if you shift something in visually up by an octave in frequency, it looks like a different colour. There seems absolutely no resemblance to it at all. And so our experience of light it's very different from our experience of sound. And it seems at least kind of interesting thought experiment. Maybe extraterrestrials might experience light much like we experience sound. They might be in a different kind of environment from the Earth, where it is important to be able to distinguish many different visual frequencies, and to distinguish light in the same way that we need to distinguish sound in our environment. And so their eyes then may have lots and lots of different receptors just like we do, but they're all tuned to slightly different colours. So they can, and all together in tiny spot. And so they would experience the different frequencies of the light in much, much more detail than we do. It certainly seems physiologically possible, though it doesn't seem that any human animals have followed that particular path, as far as I know. So that's one way in which their experience of sound might be different from ours, but this is a translation thing. You can translate, if they experience vision like we experience sound, you can translate one into the other. And so we might well they might be able to experience our music, and we might be able to experience their vision by doing a translation. And there are other ways in which things could be translated as well. And of course, this translating of vision into sound is something we do anyway, by the way. For instance, when you listen to radio telescopes, sometimes the engineers and radio telescopes will listen to the radio waves as sounds, and you hear an awful lot more detail in the sounds like that. And I don't know if it's you put to any practical use, but you certainly can get these recordings of radio waves translated into sound, and you get quite interesting sound effects sometimes. And you can hear things that way that you couldn't possibly see if you was trying to translate it into light. Now, another way in which their experience of sound might be different from human sound is, of course, it could be much higher pitched or lower pitched than us, the sounds they can hear. So it might be like bats, and the bat squeaks we hear at the very lower range of the bat's hearing, and they make sounds that are far too high even for young children to be able to hear. And so the extraterrestrials, most of their sounds might be very, very high in frequency and we can't hear them, and or they might be very low in frequency, like the infrasound of elephants, which are thought to be a significant part of their communication, and they communicate with each other miles apart through infrasound, and human beings simply can't hear it at all. So this is a translation thing, so you could translate it up in frequency, use and down in frequency again, and we could hopefully appreciate their music if it is based on similar principles to ours. Then another way it could differ is through the time sense. So it's quite possible. Now this is something that isn't not much talked about it's quite rare in science fiction stories that nearly always the extraterrestrials in science fiction stories experience time very much as we do. They don't speak incredibly quickly, they don't speak incredibly slowly. They move roughly the same speed as we do as well. And they don't just kind of walk around like tortoises. And they don't move around as quickly as birds do either. So the tortoises, obviously, they must experience life at a much slower pace than we do. And for a tortoise, lent to a very slow piece of earth music, of human music, would sound surely extremely fast. And for what seems like a comfortable pace of music to us, so that's a very normal, relaxed, steady kind of pace, so that's andante, and that's based on human walking pace, or based on human heartbeat, about once a second or thereabouts, that kind of a range. And if you go even just double that, then it sounds very fast to us. If you do just half of that, it sounds very slow to us. And if you do 3 times, it sounds extremely fast. So this time sense, again, it's a translation thing. We might need to slow their music down in order to appreciate it. We might need to speed it up. And we have examples in our life, like my bird table out there. Then the birds that come and feed there, they react much more quickly than human beings do. And people who try to study and look at the interactions of birds on bird tables, then you need to slow it down with high-speed cameras in order to see what's going on. They react with each other, to each other, far more quickly than the human eye can follow. And their bird song also, it has details in it at a much higher speed than for human beings, human songs, animal songs. So here is, just go up and get this, and let's find it. This is the song of a mockingbird, apparently. So you might think that was maybe a troop of monkeys or something, or that's about the pace that human beings, if you like, sort of sing in a comfortable way, not playing something virtuosic or something, then that's about our pace of the way we appreciate music. And this is birdsong, but it's slowed down to a quarter of its normal speed. So perhaps birds' song is maybe the pace of time sense of birds. Perhaps it's about 4 times faster than humans, the way that they experience the passage of time. But again, this is a translation that you could translate the fast time sense to a slower one and so on. And this, with humans anyway, it's based on our heartbeat. It's to do with the rhythms of our life. And rhythm is something that may be much more common than pitch. So it certainly in human creatures, then just about all human creatures, I don't mean human earth creatures, just about all of the creatures on earth, they have some rhythms in their lives. You know, there's day and night, apart from very few situations like the deep hydrothermal vents, where there's really no changes from day to night, and hardly any changes in the season, and in caves. But in almost all other situations, then there's the passage of day and night. There's also the rhythms of your body, of course, and the rhythms of the seasons, the rhythms of the months as well. There are many rhythms in our lives. And it seems likely that many extraterrestrials also would have rhythms in their lives, and they might well have something that's a little bit like music that involves rhythms at least. So there might be some communication of rhythm. Another thing that is almost universal amongst animals on the earth is a sense of touch. Even microorganisms, and things like snails, they have a hard shell, but inside there's a soft, sensitive body, and they have a sense of touch as well. So, and with a sense of touch, you also get a possibility of experience of pitch that way as well. And for instance, profoundly deaf musicians, so Evelyn Glennie, the famous percussionist who is profoundly deaf, and she experiences rhythms through a sense of touch, but she also has experience of pitch as well, so she can feel the pitches of notes through her hands and through her feet. So that you can have some experience of pitch as well through a sense of touch. So touch being so universal, then there may be a certain kind of universality to music there as well. And perhaps if they can't appreciate it as sound, perhaps they might be able to experience how music as touch. But in order to experience, and the sense of rhythm may be very common, but in order to experience this sense of rhythm, you do need a kind of time sense. It seems very likely that extraterrestrials would at least have very short-term memory, such as we have, like just for the last few seconds, so that they can react to things. But would they experience time beyond that, the way that we do? And it's if they live in an environment with many rhythms and changes of day and night, you would think that locating things in time like that would be important. But we do have other aspects, like we don't experience time entirely linearly, even human beings. So there is a way in which our memories are to a certain extent spatial. So if you walk in and out of a room, then apparently you're much more likely to forget things if you walk through a doorway. So if you walk the same distance, but there's a doorway in between where you came from and where you go to, then apparently you're more likely to forget what it was that you had before, that you wanted to remember, than if you don't walk through a doorway. And then there's also a non-temporal way that we kind of remember things from the distant past. So you might be try to remember, for instance, the name of someone that you knew maybe 10, 20 years ago or whatever, and you think, oh, what was their name? Might it be Emma? Maybe she was called Emma. Was it Emily? And you think, both those kind of seem possibly not sure. It might be, might not be. And then maybe a day or two later, you suddenly remember, and oh yes, she was called Amanda, and you just remember the name just like that, and then you're absolutely sure at that point. But you don't remember a particular. It's not like you go back in time and you remember a particular time, and then suddenly you eventually manage to get back. So how many years, decades ago, whatever it was, but it just comes right in the present. And there's no time sense. You don't know where that name comes from in a way. So extraterrestrials, we have this in our memory. For extraterrestrials, it's possible that this could be much stronger for them than our linear sense of time. And they mightn't have a very strong linear sense of time. Now it seems to me that that's most likely to happen if the extraterrestrials live in a very steady environment, like hydrothermal vents, but there may be entire worlds that are like that. We actually have an example in our solar system. It's even not impossible. It may seem a bit far out, but we certainly can't disprove the possibility that there might be extraterrestrials living there. And here I'm talking about a possible place in our solar system where there could be extraterrestrials, and they could be completely undetected by us and us by them. And this would be if they were living in the seas of Europa. So the seas of Europa, this is the innermost moon of Jupiter. And the interesting thing about it is that it has oxygen that is thought to be quite oxygen rich, because the high ionizing radiation from Jupiter, this hitting on the surface ice, and it apparently creates very significant amounts of oxygen by dissociating the water. to such an extent that even over the very long timescales of kind of geological processes eventually being subducted into the ice, then it should make the oceans beneath very oxygen rich. So there's potential there for not just like plant life, but even like animals like ourselves, creatures that need an awful lot of energy in order to survive. And there are enough energy sources there, not just from the hydrothermal vents, but or if they have such, but also from the oxygen in the atmosphere, or the oxygen in the water. So whether or not there are extraterrestrials in Europa, in the seas of Europa, and there's absolutely no way of knowing, but there's certainly, it seems to be likely to be a very common habitat in our galaxy, and a place where extraterrestrials could evolve. And if you evolved there in a deep sea, and maybe especially if you didn't have hands that were like dolphins or something, you could have an advanced civilization but no technology at all. But even if you had hands, even if you were like an octopus or something quite dexterous, still it might be quite hard to do much, even with intelligence and even with some way of manipulating things. But you wouldn't have, for instance, fire. You wouldn't see things burn. You would have heat, and you would have lava flows occasionally, and you might be able to use those to smelt iron or whatever at some point, once you develop intelligence, or drop rocks into it or whatever, and route it into different places and so on. But you can imagine that the technology, even their most advanced technology, might be quite limited, and probably not very likely to develop, a computer chip or spacecraft and things like that. Maybe even after billions of years they would never even think of such things. But whether or not there is some extraterrestrial civilization in Europe, or there may be in other parts of the galaxy, and they may eventually, maybe some of them very unusual civilizations, one way or another, either we travel to find them. And in the case of Europa, if we did eventually explore Europa, in a very careful way, of course, not to cause any harm to Europa, then maybe, if there were extraterrestrials, it's a kind of very remote possibility maybe, but they might be our first extraterrestrial contacts, if there were extraterrestrials in Europa, and they might have a very different time sense from us. So, in an environment like that, completely covered in ice, and no experience of the sun, totally unaware even that the external universe exists at all, and a steady environment, their floor may be a bit warmer, the ceiling of their world would be ice, and for them it might be much more important for memories to be organised spatially rather than according to time. Now this is just my own idea, just an idea I'm throwing out. I haven't seen anyone else suggest it, but it just seems quite likely. And so they might then, but then if you imagine that perhaps they are able to appreciate music, they might understand pictures organised in a different way from the way we do, not in terms of rhythm, but in some kind of spatial way of organising the pictures. And there is actually a whole idea that's been developed in modern music of this kind of musical geometry. So I'll talk about that in my next talk, when I'm talking about some of the range of different types of human music and what they might tell us about how extraterrestrials might experience music. And so there are these kind of musical geometries where musical pitches have a kind of natural location in space, and the music can be kind of quite static because of that kind of weightless static effect to it. And for all we know, the kind of Earth linear sense of time that we have might be quite unusual in the galaxy. If most of the extraterrestrials live in environments like Europa, then we might come across extraterrestrials that don't think in a kind of linear time sense kind of way, where human beings do. And this might make communication with them quite difficult. There are one or two interesting science fiction stories about that, about extraterrestrials that simply don't think in a linear fashion. It's quite a fun idea to explore and then you can imagine maybe having this spatial music might be one of the few ways that we can have mutual appreciation of their culture and them of us. So anyway, this is just next, and I'm going to do a separate talk and article, and I'm going to write this up as a science20.com article, and I just thought I'd talk about it first to the camera, as it were, first, before writing it out. And so there are a few ideas I thought would be fun to explore. And so now I haven't worked it out yet what I'm going to say, but sometime I'm going to give a talk about the different types of human music and the different kinds of systems. You'd be surprised at what a range of different types of music we have. And the music you hear need all the time. And the radio, it's limited, both musically and rhythmically. So both in terms of pitch and in terms of rhythm. In terms of pitch, it is most of it just limited to 12 notes out of the kind of almost infinite possibilities of pitches, and it's limited to a few rhythms, most of it. Most of it is in rhythms like 4 beats to a measure. It's very, very common. And is this something that we would have in common with extraterrestrial music? And we can look around and see that actually lots of different ways that pitch and rhythms are organised in human culture, and perhaps it would tell us something. And perhaps there are some things that are also universal between different musical systems. So that's what I want to look at next.